Year 12 Ancient History, and welcome to the Queensland Museum. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Jalen Faliafaga. I study epidemiology and I will be your exhibition guide for today. Does anyone in the class know what an epidemiologist is? Not confidently, yet what is a biologist doing in a museum? Well, epidemiology is the study or analysis of diseases, and my interests also lay in the evolution of medieval Europe. With the combination of the two, I introduced to you the white pandemic, which struck a nation, the Black Death. The Black Death sounds like a rather significant event. Could you please provide context? The Black Death, the later name given to what was initially referred to as the bubonic plague, was an epidemic which had oppressed the citizens of Europe and Asia. One of the common theories surrounding the core origin or the distribution of the plague was through bacterium, Yersinia pestis. This bacterium would survive within rodent populations and through flea bites would infect persons and mammals existent. The plague had apparently hit Europe in 1347, where 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port at Messina. Unfortunately, the Europeans were scarcely equipped for the harsh reality nor the detrimental effects of the Black Plague. The Dark Ages were a time with established fundamental beliefs and values that influenced the order and functioning of society. The three main ideologies which existed in that time period were religious power, political and governmental dominance, and the feudal system. Through the analysis of images, medieval artifacts, and scripts, we will discover how this pandemic had a negative impact on medieval Europe, allowing society to challenge the dominant beliefs which existed in that time. So what specifically are we going to be looking at? Well, the tour will venture through three sections of the Dark Ages exhibition: religious, political, and economic power. We will explore how the Black Death had affected society's beliefs in Christianity, the stability of the government, and the feudal system, where serfs and slaves claimed economic freedom. Now, if you would in 2 lines, file towards the first part of the exhibition. Before we enter, does anyone know of the importance of Christianity and what kind of impact it had on medieval society? Well, according to Barron, religion supposedly laid the framework for how medieval society functioned. Religion was a prominent ideology and was heavily integrated into all aspects of life. In many cases, it is common to find that religion gave people a sense of comfort and hope. Thus, the church inadvertently dominated the lives of all medieval people during the Dark Ages. That is correct. Yet, would anyone like to share with the group what relevance the Black Death had on Christian faith? We're not sure. That is fine. Let us now make our way to the first ancient script. Here in this case, we have an extract from Henry Knighton's 1398 novel Chronicle. Within this extract reads the words: "But after 20 days' journey, hearing that the plague had created a great havoc among Christians, turned and went no farther on that way, but hastened home unto his own country." What relevance does this text have towards Christianity and the Black Death? This quote speaks on behalf of Pope Clement VI, who was Supreme Pontiff, or more simply recognized as the official leader of the worldwide Catholic Church. His role during the invasion of the plague was to reassure people of their safety through baptism. This primary source is a perfect demonstration of how religion or the Christian faith were challenged. Let's put our focus towards the phrase, "turned and went no farther on that way, but hastened home unto his own country." This implies that the Pope, who had devoted most of his life to religious duties, that the exhibition of faith towards the Lord was not enough to stop this pandemic. Where Knighton states that he hastened home unto his own country implies a sense of fear and loss in the confidence in the Lord, returning home to find another source of protection. Based on these implicit readings, how do you as the audience feel the church, religious figures, or Christianity have been represented through the source? Clearly, after the death of many Christians, the overall representativeness of the church, religious figures, and Christianity were negative. To my interpretation, they would have gained a rather damaging reputation, where many would have claimed God's inexistence and his inability to protect those who had wholeheartedly abided by him. Impressive! To add further context, Pope Clement VI had granted remission of sins to all who had died of the plague, indiscriminatory of gender, race, age, status, or beliefs. Through this act of remission, the Pope had therefore contradicted all Christian values and standards. Let's bring our attention to the plague, which collectively summarizes the impact of the Black Death on Christianity. Do I have any volunteers to read what it says? The overall confidence and faith in the Church from the lay people diminished during the plague, and its subsequent outbreaks the Church suffered just as they did. People were able to see the human side of the Church. What is the implicit meaning of this also? The Church has always had an immortal stigma to it, where the Church was perceived as invincible by the general public. However, this phrase suggests that consequent to the plague, as much as the lay people or the general public suffered, so did priesthood. Taking into consideration that many heads of church had died from the Black Death, it clearly refutes the Church's link to immortality, as they were suffering from the outbreak of the plague. Thus, the Church can be seen as a manipulative institution in which the public thought they carried some sort of supremacy and dominance over the general public. This plaque clearly reiterates medieval society's lack of confidence in God and also the Church's vulnerability. Do you think the source contains any prejudice? There is bias evident in the source, where it says the Church suffered just as they did. People were able to see their human side, carries a negative connotation, as the Church's motives were to convey a dominant reputation of themselves onto society. This test basically challenges their authority and their claims of being closely linked to virtue. This is a justification of prejudice as it takes a negative stance against the Church's efforts to assert governance. If the apparent decline of Christian faith was so prevalent, why is Christianity still one of the most followed religions in the world? Good question. Over here, if you look at the projector, Louisa Woodville writes in one of her Khan Academy blogs, adding onto the prevalence of Christianity after the Black Death, that some Christians became more pious, believing that their piety might endear them to a God who they believed had sent the plague to punish them for their sins. This refutes the idea that the popularity in Christian faith had declined, for there was still a large minority of devotees who believed that this was rather God's vengeance against those impious. Instead of questioning God, they became more devout, in hopes of staying free from the plague. This quote is a reflection of the minority's persistence and also on religion and its powerful influence on medieval society. To what extent is Louisa Woodville credible? I've done my background research on Louisa Woodville. She currently teaches at George Mason University and specializes in medieval and Renaissance art history. And I think given her extensive background in the humanities unit, the information she provides are reliable. Thank you, Student 2, for providing a brief analysis of Woodville's credibility. That is all for the religious section of the exhibition. Please join me while onwards to the political section of the Dark Ages tour. So here framed is one of my favourite pieces by Peter Bruegel, The Triumph of Death. Would anyone like to describe what they see in the picture? Just basic implicit interpretations. Well, it is obvious that Bruegel had created a dark emphasis on the fatality of the Black Death, as the colours used to paint the image are of a darker tone, the reds, the browns, and the dark burgundy. Made prominent are the large piles of bodies and skeletons which seem to be patrolling the streets. I still don't see how this suggests that the Black Death had affected the stability of the government. Every piece of art is up for interpretation, yet through the use of warmer or darker tones, I am immediately drawn to feel saddened and scared, just as the people in that time would have felt as the plague invaded. It can be implied that the skeletons pictured on the horses, standing in groups, are depictions of members of the government. They are in skeletal form to represent the many people in the government who were infected. In addition, the skeletons seem to be in groups around the cross, as they could be members of the government who are also part of the church. Overall, this painting depicts the government's instability, their lack of control, and their inability to suppress the terror of the Black Death. Student 1. How do you feel about the government based off of my interpretation? I feel like the government may have not experienced such a disastrous event and makes me appreciate the evolution of society, where we can indulge in the comfort of modern technology and science. Good interpretation and link to modern society. Now let us make us way to, let us make our way to the last piece of the political exhibit. Here we have projected a website by Jen Saunders called What Political Effects Did the Black Death Have on Middle Ages? In the projected secondary source, it states that most government officials and political figures locked themselves away in their homes until they died. As more government heads succumbed to the plague, instability ruled. Foreign sovereigns stepped in, setting up nation states that eventually led to the powerful parties that controlled Europe during the Renaissance. Would anyone like to try and provide an implicit meaning on the source? The term themselves, in which it states in the text, are referring to the members of the government, which they had domesticated or isolated themselves, means that they had no intentions of trying to get assistance. It can also be inferred that if members of the government were contracting illnesses, who was given the responsibility to give guidance, to reassure and control the lay people? This inevitably allowed foreign powers to challenge the authority of the government. As for their loss of power and control, foreign nations had to intervene, otherwise Europe would have succumbed. If it were not for foreign intervention, Europe would not have been able to overcome the Black Death pandemic. Furthermore, this is a reflection of how underdeveloped Europe was against other nations. After viewing this source, written by Jen Saunders, whom, if I can provide background, is an entrepreneur, veteran journalist, and English teacher, explores very significant values and attitudes in the source. This text entails negative attitudes such as ignorance and dependence, where government officials are forcing themselves through seclusion to avoid any contact with the plague. They are dependent as they rely on allies to come to their liberation after being so contingent on their hiding from the plague. Now, students, this is the last stop for the political exhibit of the Dark Ages tour. Follow me to the economy exhibit. Does the term feudal system sound familiar? We have touched on it briefly, but not thoroughly. By definition, the feudal system was a political, military, and social system in the Middle Ages, based on the holding of hands and fee for a fee, and on the resulting relations between lord and vassal. So, in a more simplistic way of putting it, the feudal system is the social hierarchy which existed in the medieval Europe, where the lay people worked and fought for nobles, who in return gave them protection and land. Yes, now if you look to your left, we have two photographs. In the first frame shows a peasant house prior to the Black Death, and in the second frame, it shows a peasant house after the Black Death. Student 1, could you please give a brief description of the two images and how they could possibly relate to serfdom and the economic upsurge in the feudal system? In the first frame, the one-story house is in poor condition, the exterior of the house made of hay. Contrary to the first frame, the other is a two-story house. The contents are well upheld, painted, and the architecture is well designed. However, what does this have to do with the economic upsurge with the serfdom and the feudal system? There is an obvious difference between the two images, as they reflect the distinctive economic status of a peasant prior and subsequent to the plague. Through living conditions, we are able to identify how the Black Death had affected the lives of serfs living in medieval Europe. As you know, serfs were at the nethermost end of the social hierarchy, working lower to middle-class lives to maintain a living. This involves agriculture, trade, and the blacksmith industry. So in terms of the feudal system, they worked for the wealthy to earn a living. To provide further context, the images are corroborated by a secondary source written by James Surowiecki, which, if you may look at another projection on the wall. Would someone like to read the quote? The Black Death helped undermine feudalism. The population decline was so severe that the individual's labour grew more valuable, which enabled serfs to abandon their lords and become tenant farmers or urban workers. So this quote is suggesting that due to many of the wealthy dying from the plague, the serfs were given the ultimate power to demand a better living. Hence, if we refer back to the previous images, the transition of serfs living in a small cottage to living in a house similar to what noblemen were living in, this demonstrates the enhanced quality of life they had enjoyed consequent to the invasion of the Black Death. Through the images and the quote provided by Swarovski, it can be clearly understood how the Black Death had affected the economic power in medieval Europe, and also how they had challenged the ideology of the feudal system. Awesome implicit interpretations. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of the tour guide. Let us further consult and summarize the information we have discussed with the previous arguments. It can be established that through the analysis of primary photographs, secondary sources, and ancient medieval scripts, the Black Death had very significant religious, political, and economic impacts on Europe, affecting society's belief in Christianity, where citizens were questioning the very reality of God. A large portion of those affected by the Black Death were, in fact, heads of state. Many figures of authority had fled regions affecting the Black Death, and therefore the stability of the government had crumbled. As a result of the deadly pandemic, many slaves of the entire serfdom were in high demand. This was in result of the many wealthy casualties. Overall, it can be found that due to the Black Death pandemic, the ideologies which surrounded the religious, political, and economic power were challenged. Thank you, Year 12 Ancient History, for attending the Dark Ages exhibition.